The Doll by Carol Ellis. The man had been out since sunrise, walking along the narrow strip of sand at the base of the rocky cliff. It was a beautiful place to walk, except for the garbage. Drivers up along the cliff road tossed down everything from greasy fast food bags to broken beach chairs. The man usually ignored it, but something caught his eyes this morning, wedged in a wide space between two big boulders. Curious, because it looked different from most of the stuff people dumped here. He walked over and pulled it out. It had been scratched up a little, and there was one big crack along the bottom, but it had survived the fall from the cliff top, which was something of a miracle. He slid his fingers over the latch, but it was tight and his hands were cold. He sat down on a flat rock and blew on his fingers. When his hands warmed up, he'd try again. 3 months earlier, a few miles away from the cliff road, 16-year-old Abby Rogers and her family had moved into their new house. It wasn't new at all, really. Abby's mother, Deanna, thought that it must have been built in the 1870s, although it had obviously been redone several times. "It looks ancient," Lindsay grumbled. Abby's sister was 10 and thought anything old was disgusting, her favorite word for things that she didn't like. "I still wish we'd moved into the condo. That swimming pool was fantastic." "And the condo was fantastically expensive," Deanna pointed out. She hefted a cardboard box onto the small front porch and pushed her hair out of her eyes. "The condo didn't have any trees either," Abby said. "There's that huge one out back, remember, Lindsay? Maybe you can build a tree house in it." Lindsay's frown faded. "Good idea," Deanna said. She turned the key in the lock and pushed open the front door. "This is great, isn't it? Our first official night in the house." Abby hadn't been crazy about moving. She couldn't do anything about it, though. Since her parents had divorced 4 years ago, making the payments on the old house had gotten harder and harder. And she kept reminding herself that it wasn't like they were moving out of town. She'd still go to the same school and have the same friends. She'd still wonder whether Mark Halpern would ask her out this year. Still, Abby had been reluctant to leave their old neighborhood, so she was surprised and a little confused by her reaction to the house. The first time she'd seen it, she'd felt drawn to it. She wasn't sure why. It was old, and it sagged, and the yard was mostly weeds. But there was something about the steep roof and the tall old windows, something that made her feel like the place was reaching for her. Once she'd seen it, she couldn't wait to move in. At dinner that first night, Deanna flattened a paper bag from the deli and wrote a list of chores on it. Unstick the windows, paint every room, pull up the kitchen linoleum, clean out the attic. "I'll do the attic," Abby said, without even thinking. "Are you sure?" Her mother looked at her curiously. "It's going to be baking hot up there, and it's completely unfinished. No windows? I thought you hated closed, stuffy places like that." "I'll still do it." Abby didn't blame her mother for being surprised. Small, airless rooms, elevators, closets, always made her feel panicky. But the attic, even more strongly than the house itself, seemed as if it were pulling her to it. The next morning, shortly after her mother had left for work, Abby tied a scarf over her fine blonde hair, opened the hatch in the upstairs hall, and climbed up. Her mother had warned her about the heat, but Abby was still overwhelmed. It was like a living thing, thick and so heavy that she felt as if a hand were pressing down on her, squeezing out her breath, making her knees buckle, making her dizzy. She leaned against the flaking bricks of the chimney and closed her eyes for a moment. Sweat was already beading on her face and rolling down her sides in trickling rivulets. She wiped her arm across her forehead and tried to breathe slowly. From outside, she could hear the faint thump of a hammer on wood. Lindsay had started working on her treehouse. She heard the chirping of birds, too, and the occasional swish of a car. In a few more seconds, she opened her eyes. Sunlight crept in where the roof met the floor, and dust motes danced crazily in their shafts. A single bare light bulb hung from the center of the roof, its long string dangling within Abby's reach. She pulled on it, and a weak light spilled down into the middle of the room, leaving the far corners in shadow. The heat, the closeness, the thought of spiders, any one of them would usually have made Abby give up before she'd even started. But something was waiting for her here. She could feel it, sense its presence in the airless shadows. With a strange sense of urgency, Abby waded into the piles of sagging cardboard boxes, stuffed paper bags, and rolled up carpet remnants. She had to find whatever it was that was waiting. She searched for an hour frantically until her hands were black with grime and her clothes were covered with dust. At last she found what she was looking for. The moment she pulled it from a paper bag so old it shredded to pieces in her fingers, she knew that this was it. In her hands was a rectangular wooden box, thick with dust like everything else. It was a handsome box, or would be when the smooth wood and the tarnished brass catch were polished. Abby could feel an energy pulsing through the thick wood of the box and into her hands, hands that shook as she fumbled with the catch and lifted the lid. Inside the box was a doll. Bedded on white satin that had yellowed with age, the doll lay like a small dead child. Its shiny black hair was piled high on its head, and its dress of lilac satin looked like something a woman would have worn 100 years ago. The skirt was long and full, the waist was tight, and the high neck and long sleeves were edged with lace. The dark-lashed eyes in the china face were as blue as the sky, as blue as Abby's, and they were wide open. The staring sky-blue eyes seemed aware, alive, and filled with an emotion so powerful that Abby gasped. For a moment, she thought she saw hatred in those eyes. But it was only a moment. Abby blinked and lifted the doll from its box. The eyes were empty, lifeless. It was just an old doll with blue glass eyes glittering in the feeble light of the dingy attic. Later, after she'd cleaned out half the attic, Abby took the doll downstairs to her room. Smoothing its satin skirt, she put it on a long shelf where she kept a few stuffed animals, another doll her father had sent her from Mexico, 2 lopsided clay pots she'd made in art class last year, and a bunch of shells she'd found at the beach. The doll sat on the shelf like a queen, imperious and cold, its face turned toward Abby's bed. "I don't see what you want to keep it for," Lindsay said that night after Abby had put the doll in place. "It's so old it's disgusting." "I don't see why you care," Abby told her. She was laying on the bed staring across at the doll. "But she happens to be beautiful. Mom thinks it might be an antique, maybe valuable." "So why don't you sell it? I would." "I know you would," Abby said, "but I don't want to. Think of it this way, Lindsay. I just liberated her. She's a free woman now." "Yeah, right," Lindsay snorted. "Why don't you scram?" Abby suggested cheerfully. After Lindsay left, Abby switched out the bedside lamp and stretched out to sleep. The light from a street lamp filtered in through the thin white curtains, and across the room Abby could see the doll's eyes shining in the shadows. The eyes wouldn't close. Her mother said they must be stuck, probably because they were so old, or maybe they were never meant to shut. The only way to know would be to take off the doll's head, but it was delicate, and there was always a chance that it might break. Abby couldn't do that, any more than she could have left the doll in the attic. Now that she'd found it, she couldn't risk destroying it. She'd just have to live with the doll's strange, staring eyes. School started a week later, and so did Abby's dreams. She thought at first that it must be all the changes in her life. New house, new rooms, new classes. By the time Abby learned the true cause of the dreams, it was too late. She tried to forget the dreams, but they stayed with her, shadowing her days like clouds and keeping her awake late at night, staring across the room into the doll's sightless eyes. The dreams were eerie, strange little scenes that made no sense but filled her with dread as she watched, twisting and turning in her sleep. But it was what happened after she woke up that was so frightening. She began to wonder if the face looking back at her from the mirror every day was an Abby she'd never known, an Abby who dreamed of danger but was powerless to stop it. The first victim was her friend, Erin Gray. It was Friday night, the end of the first week of school. Erin was sleeping over at Abby's house after the two of them had gone to the movies. Before they went to sleep, around 1 a.m, Erin tried to convince Abby that Mark Halpern wasn't her type. "I know he's cool," Erin said from her sleeping bag on the floor, "but he never sticks with anybody. He's with a new girl every week." "Well, I don't want to marry him, Erin," Abby said. "I just want to date him." "Oh, Abby." Erin stood up and walked across the room. She took the doll down from the shelf and absent-mindedly turned it over in her hands while she talked. "You know you'll be miserable when he dumps you." She was flipping the doll up and down. "What's wrong with this thing? Its eyes won't close." "It's a doll, not a thing, and I don't know why," Abby said. "Anyway, you're wrong about Mark." "I just don't want to see you get hurt, okay?" Erin plunked the doll back on the shelf and snuggled into the sleeping bag. "I also don't want to have to say I told you so." Abby laughed and switched out the light. A few moments later, Erin's sleepy voice came wafting up from the floor. Abby? Huh? That doll's eyes are giving me the creeps. Do you mind if I turn it around or something? Go ahead. Abby watched sleepily as Erin moved across the room, her long white t-shirt a pale blur in the shadows. As Erin came back, Abby's eyes were drifting closed. For a second, she woke again with a jerk, feeling an icy touch on her back, a touch that made her shiver even though the room was warm. But then the touch was gone, and Abby sank into a deep sleep. She saw a hand, a small, pale hand out in the hall. She didn't know or couldn't see what it was doing, but she knew it was the hall outside her room because she recognized the peeling, ivy-patterned wallpaper that they hadn't stripped off the walls yet, and the painted baseboard that her mother wanted to sand down to the original wood. The hand was delicate and fine-boned, a girl's hand, like a pale, fluttering moth that hovered near the floor at the top of the stairs for a moment, then pulled back gently into the darkness. Abby woke up to the sound of a scream. The room was dark, but a sliver of light came under the door from the hallway, and she heard muffled voices out there. It was Erin talking to Abby's mother. Abby swung her legs over the side of the bed and went to the door. It's okay, I'll live, Erin was saying. I think. What happened? Abby blinked in the hall light. Are you all right? I heard you yell. You'd yell too if you almost broke your neck, Erin said. I wanted to get a drink, so I was going to go downstairs, but I didn't make it to the top step even. She bent over and rubbed her knee. I tripped. On what? Abby's mother was looking around the top of the stairs. There's nothing here to trip on. I don't know, Erin frowned, but something was there. I felt it. The three of them stared at the top of the stairs, then at each other. Abby felt something nudging her memory, some thought or image, but she couldn't catch hold of it. Finally, they all went back to bed. That was scary, Erin said as she lay back down on the sleeping bag. But at least I didn't fall all the way down. Those stairs are steep. I know. I'm glad you're all right. Abby got in bed and closed her eyes, then opened them again when Erin got up. What are you doing? Turning this doll around, Erin said from across the room. I thought you already did that. I did, but I guess it slipped because I can see the eyes again. It wasn't until the next day, after Erin had left, that Abby remembered her dream. The pale hand hovering, almost floating at the top of the stairs, in the very spot where Erin had fallen. Had the hand been trying to point, to let her know that something was going to happen there? Almost a week later, Abby and Erin and Holly Roselle, another friend, were sitting around the table in Abby's kitchen, studying for a test in social studies. They'd tried to study in Abby's room, but like Erin, Holly couldn't stand the doll's eyes. They're awful, she'd said. It's like they're watching me all the time. So the three of them had taken their books into the kitchen. I never do any good on these essay tests, Holly complained. How do we know what to study for if we don't know what the questions are going to be? I know what you mean, said Erin, who was at the refrigerator pulling out a bottle of soda. Abby stood beside her at the counter, refilling the bowl of popcorn. Holly was sitting, with her elbows on the table, her chin in her hands. The light from the hanging lamp overhead made her dark hair gleam. Abby turned to say something to her, and that's when it happened. There was no time for a warning. 1 second, the stained glass lamp was hanging from its chain above the tabletop, and the next second it was dropping straight down, crashing with a shattering of glass onto Holly's head. It was Erin who pulled the lamp away, Erin who started to wipe the blood from Holly's face, and then ran to get Abby's mother. Abby had screamed when the lamp fell, but after that she was silent, paralyzed, looking on in horror as her mother calmed Holly down so that she could look at the gash on her head. Abby heard her mother say that she didn't think it was as deep as it seemed, but that head cuts always bled badly. She watched as her mother and Erin helped Holly up, heard her mother say that she'd take her home. She watched it all, but at the same time she was remembering.